Hello, welcome to my channel Dalma Makes, and welcome to this project. I made another mimic, this time a book mimic. Of course, this could be any other monstrous book according to your imagination. I actually wanted to make a proper little book with binded pages. So I'm going to be using this tea-dyed paper, and after I selected a number of images that I got from the internet, I just printed them off on my inkjet printer. I'm making a fairly small book, and I'm just going to use a paper trimmer to cut out the pages. I'm cutting them out so that they're double pages that are going to work like the signatures of the book. So the idea with these images are that they sort of look like a wizard's spell book or a magic manual. The content really doesn't matter. Of course, after I cut out all the pages, I'm just folding them, taking care that I'm quite precise, and I'm going to measure and mark at 5 points because I'm going to be using a thread and needle to bind these pages together. But before I realized while they're still not joined together is probably the best time to ink the edges to bring a little bit of extra weathering to these pages. I like to make the paper look like it's really old. And of course the tea dyeing really helps with that as well. Of course, it could be blank, and if you make your own, you can use it as a small little notebook. But for me, I just wanted a sort of prop that can be used in my Dungeons and Dragons games. So with all the pages marked, I'm going to pierce each one in 5 spots. These are going to be the holes for sewing, and I'm just gonna do that for each one. It helps as a guide and also reduces the struggle of having to pierce through the paper with the actual needle when I'm binding. To make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to wax the thread that I'm using for binding, and I'm using just a sewing needle to start with. I'm using the kettle stitch method for this book binding. It's just a way to bind the signatures together that allows for full mobility without much tension. I'm definitely no bookbinding expert, but I wanted to make this effort instead of gluing them together, just so the pages can turn really nicely. And I also think it adds to the effect of being an older book. For a better explanation of how this bookbinding method works, I'm going to leave a link in the description to a tutorial where I learned how to do this from. After a while, I changed my mind and I switched to a curved needle because I was working with such a small thing. It was putting a lot of pressure when I was threading my needle in through the signatures, and I just remembered that I actually do own curved needles now for this specific purpose of bookbinding, so I just switched over and it went much better and quicker, and it was easier to get it done. Now with that done, I'm actually happy that the pages turn really nicely. For the cover of the book, I'm going to be using some chipboard, and this is actually already doubled down, as in 2 sheets have been glued together. And I've just roughly measured at first how large I need the covers, and then I made more precise measurements with the ruler and just trimming out the front and back covers. And checking that, yeah, it's gonna work. I just cut them out slightly larger than the text block. I'm also going to be using a scrap of this pattern paper to join the covers to the text block. And I just cut out 3 pieces. 2 of them are going to be attaching the covers, and I'm going to use a leftover to just go over the spine. I'm not actually going to be gluing it straight onto the spine, but I am going to apply some glue to those threads just to make sure that my knots will stay in place forever. And I'm attaching these pieces of paper with a glue stick. It really bonds paper to paper really well. And I'm going to do the same and actually attach the covers to that extra flap of paper that I added. For the outside spine of the book, I wanted to add something flexible but nice and sturdy, so I'm using a small scrap of leather that I had in my stash, and I'm just cutting a piece out. And as you can see, I'm making sure that I'm only attaching it to the outside covers without actually gluing it onto the spine. This way it opens and it leaves room for mobility. I know I want to make a monster face on top, so I'm going to be using these small glass cabochons for the eyes. And to turn them into eyes, I'm actually going to paint the pupil and the iris on the very back of the cabochons. First adding black pupils, leaving them to dry. And then I'm going to be using some red paint to paint the irises on with like little strokes and flicks of a very fine detail brush. After all, I do want to create as monstrous eyes as possible. I'm just carefully taking my time and always checking my work because obviously the glass is going to work like magnification. When the red has dried, I'm going to add some white for the sclera of the eye, basically cover all of the background. So it's 3 layers of paint there. I painted the eyes first because I wanted them to be dry enough for when I'm going to be pressing them into the clay. Before actually sculpting the face, I wanted to add some more texture to the book covers themselves, and for that I'm going to be using some scraps of this leftover creepy cloth that I had from Halloween. And I'm just cutting off little pieces and sort of pulling the fabric apart here and there. This is really just for texture. To stick them on, I'm using a matte medium gel. This is going to dry completely transparent and also absorb into the fibers really nicely, ensuring that the fabric that I'm gluing on becomes one with the surface. After that's dried, I'm of course trimming off all of the bits that are hanging over the edges and just neatening things up. And I'm left with this really nicely textured cover. Now it's time for sculpting. I'm going to be using some air dry clay. And I'm also using a spray bottle with water just to moisten the surface. It really helps with the clay sticking on better. And I'm roughly shaping out the face and adding on bits to form the features. I sort of want this to look vaguely humanoid but monstrous enough. I created some eye sockets with the tips of my fingers, and I'm using a bit of PVA glue, and I'm pressing the glass eyes that I painted before. I'm also using tiny snakes of clay to sort of create eyelids, and I'm using bigger snakes of clay to create sort of horns and other features. With a medium-sized ball tool, I'm starting to add details to the features. Another main feature I wanted to have is a very toothy mouth, and I kept thinking about how am I going to sculpt those tiny teeth with air dry clay, and how am I going to make them stick in place. So instead I just cut them out of a chipboard, which turned out to be a really good idea. So I just cut out these tiny triangles for pointy teeth, pressing them into the still soft air dry clay. I've applied a generous coating of PVA glue. This will help them stay in place. I'm adding many rows of teeth inside of that creepy mouth. Actually, I just kept adding them until the mouth looked full of teeth. Going back to my shaping tools, I'm starting to add texture to the skin. I ended up going with this sort of pitted, slightly diseased looking skin. I've also created wrinkles and folds in areas of the face that make sense. I'm also applying other blobs of air dry clay, blending them in with that textured background, and I'm also using my ball tool to add the same pitted texture as the face has on the front cover. And of course I add these patches of texture on the back cover as well, unifying the whole thing. And of course I'm going to leave this to dry basically overnight. The next day, with all the clay dried, it's finally time for painting. So first of all, I'm going to apply a dark brown base coat everywhere on the cover, including those inside edges where it's not covered by the pattern paper. I need this layer of brown as a base coat so that other colors I put on top don't absorb as deeply, and also having this dark layer for shadows and recesses really helps further along in the painting process. I've also decided to add more weathering detail with the same dark brown paint on the inside covers, and I think that worked out for the best. That's mainly because I didn't stay inside of the lines to start with, but I do like the weathering effect as well. So I'm actually going to go over most everything with this really dark green next, after the brown has completely dried. Avoiding the teeth and the inside of the mouth though. You may have noticed I've painted over the glass eyes, but that is not a problem. I'm going to be scraping off the layers of acrylic paint. It comes off perfectly from the very slippery, shiny glass. It just makes my job easier. So after that layer of dark green paint, I'm adding an olive green, and I'm sort of using a dry brushing technique to lighten everything up. And the dry brushing helps with catching on all of the details of the texture on the cover and the sculpting. And of course, never forget the edges. After that olive green, I'm going to be using an even lighter, fresher looking green, and with an even softer dry brushing. And finally, I'm adding a straight up yellow, just on select areas for some color variation. Then with an off-white and a small detail brush, I'm going to paint all the teeth. It was a little bit tricky to get into the nooks and gaps between all of the rows of teeth, but I done my best to catch all of them. When that was done, I decided I needed a little bit more of a color variation. So for interest and contrast, I picked sort of like a plum purple color, and I'm applying it in little splotches all over the face of the monster, and the kind of like in areas where there's that pitted texture. And as a final step, I'm using that same off-white to dry brush to catch the highlights. And now it's time to scrape off the paint from the glass eyes and reveal the final effect of the face. And I think it came out nicely. To seal the paint job in and to tint everything in a bit of a warmer color, I'm going to be using this yellow shellac ink. I really like how it makes everything look a little bit older, a little bit more aged, and also it pulls into those pits that I sculpted into the skin texture of the monster, and it pulls into those areas of deeper texture, and I really like that as a final look. And of course it also works as a sealant. This is what my little book mimic looks like after drying. And the pages open and turn really nicely. I'm very fond of the face. It's sort of ugly and monstrous and the teeth are quite creepy, and I'm quite happy how it looks like the face just came out of the cover of the book. As mimics are the sort of monster that can pretend to be any mundane object, a book, in my opinion, is a prime candidate. I hope you enjoyed watching this video of me creating yet another little monster. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear some feedback. If you enjoy this sort of thing, please consider subscribing to my channel. I make new videos every week covering a variety of interesting and nerdy and crafty themes. Thank you for watching. I hope you're having a nice day. Bye.